In 5 days, Ukraine retook 201 square kilometers. That's 78 square miles because Russian units simply could not see. Satellite disruption did not just blur maps, it broke the chain. It tells the men, the fuel, and the shells where to go. And once command slips, Russia falls back on the only tactic it can still coordinate: mass assaults. But there's a trade off with that, because that means precision is lost in order to get greater volume. And volume, it devours ammunition, armor, and fuel at a rate that the system cannot refill. But there's another problem that's even more grave. The railway monopoly in Russia, it's carrying between 43 to $50 billion of debt. A weak rail balance sheet becomes a national security problem the moment the war demands more tonnage than the network can safely carry. Russian history has already run this experiment under pressure before. In 1917, rail breakdowns and bread shortages turned hardship into regime crisis, long before the front lines were decided by anything else. A war can survive bad news. A war cannot survive a broken supply spine, and neither can a Kremlin that is already on the cusp of bankruptcy. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and National Security Advisor. Please like this video, subscribe, hype this video, and consider becoming a channel member today. So first and foremost, Russia's rail crisis has crossed into a disastrous lane for the Russians because rail is the backbone of a land empire. A Russian Telegram reports that Russian Railways is functionally bankrupt. Sitting on this massive amount of debt, between 43 and $50 billion, is something that's no joke. In just January alone, we've seen that freight traffic has fallen 4%. Now, that's the steepest decline that Russia has seen in about 15 years. That combination means the system is shrinking while the war is demanding more from it. Another problem that the Russians have, though, is that they have a massive railway system. Remember, Russia escapes 11 time zones, so it has to cover a lot of terrain, but they are now cutting investments by 20%. But that means there's going to be deferred maintenance. And that means that the wagons will break down more often. And that means that eventually the timetables will stop being realistic. Missed schedules stack up because a delayed train blocks the next train behind it. And shortages show up as gaps first, then as price spikes when the companies pay to reroute. Now, Moscow is scrambling for cash, trying to find a way to get out of the situation, and it can't easily find one. It's already offering to sell 49% of the federal freight company. It's typically a very bad sign if your best solution in your country, which is heavily reliant on rail, is to sell off your ability to ship on rail. Now, one other interesting part about this that does change everything is the fact that the government in Russia, knowing that it has this problem, is not addressing it. That leads to a question: why don't they address it? Why are they forcing them to sell all of their offices, sell their offices in Moscow, in Riga, and around the world, if really it can be fixed somehow? There's a very simple reason: it cannot be fixed. The Russian government's best solution is to force them to liquidate, but then to put more taxes on the rail company. Somehow, higher tariffs are probably not the way to fix a failing industry. But that's not just limited to the industry of rail that we see major problems inside of Russia. It's across all of transport. Look at what we see with wholesale AI 92 gas. That jumped up 6.9% just in 1 week. AI 95, it was up 5.8% in just a week. This is the sharpest jump that Russia's had in well over a year. But there's something else going on that's fundamental to understanding the larger picture, how this all fits together. The problems in Russia are not just because there's a problem with the railways or with the gasoline or on the front. It's because today Russia has a banking system that's imploding. In 2025, 48 Russian bond issuers failed to meet bond obligations. That's the highest amount in a number of years. And it's important to understand that a bond issuer is not a corner shop. It is a company big enough to borrow from the public. When it misses a payment, lenders assume cash is failing, and not just the profits are down. And one default, it hurts one firm, while dozens changes the rules for everybody. Banks, they tighten the credit. Suppliers demand cash, and refinancing turns into a trap. The broader signal proves it is systemic, not just some unlucky firms here and there. Credit events across defaults, technical defaults, and restructurings have been jumping over the past few months. And while all this is jumping, we see the central bank in Russia is quite concerned because they don't know what to do. Now, you would imagine Russia, looking at these problems, would figure out a way to bail these banks, a way to get things back on board. But there's a reason they're not doing that. It's because they cannot. All this is happening at the exact same time that Ukraine is giving Russia hell and pushing the Russians out of Ukraine. Ukraine today is ejecting the Russian invaders. And what's incredible about it is that it's because the Russian side has become so broken. The Ukrainians, of course, are doing incredible work. They're fighting for every inch of land. But the Russian side is just simply weaker than it has been before. Despite the setbacks that Ukraine has, the regular attacks, the power being out, and the fact that it gets very cold now in Kiev, we can assure you that the people there in Kiev wish to continue fighting. The Russian side, they don't seem as excited to keep fighting. They seem more excited to get this problem out of their hair. For Russians today, it's got to look disastrous. They look around their country and they see that there's ongoing attacks by the Ukrainians. They see that within Ukraine, where they had occupied, they're being forced out. And now they're seeing that they can even get around their own country because the railway system is going the way of the dinosaurs. Meanwhile, gasoline's got more expensive, which means all costs in Russia go up. The pressure is shifting onto Russia's ability to hold, to rotate, and to resupply. And you can help put the pressure on the Russians. Check out the first pinned comment with the question of the day. I read all of your responses. And right below that, watch the video that connects the dots of today's briefings. See how you can help the Ukrainian soldiers get what they need to win. And right now, all donations are being matched. So while all of this is going on, Ukraine is giving Russia one heck of a run for their money. They never anticipated this would happen to them. Consider what we just saw in the past few hours in Crimea, which is the southern hinge for the Russians. Every strike there forces Russia to spend on air defense and on rear and not on the front. But we saw the attacks on the Belbek Air Force Base. Those detonations there are something the Russians worry about because Crimea, it doesn't have a lot of ways to get there. You can go via the bridge, you can go via ferry, and you can go by the airport. But when the airport's no longer able to operate, and we know that any day now that bridge will no longer be in place, it means it becomes a lot less of a fun, safe place to be hanging out in occupied Crimea. And if the Russians start to detect that, then they start to face the risk of panic. But there's more than that. If Crimea can be hit cleanly, nowhere in the system is truly safe anymore. We saw the attacks that Ukraine just carried out last night in the Volga region, which is deep rear territory for the Russians. The pressure there is dragging resources away from the battlefield to protect infrastructure. In the city of Izhevsk, we saw a number of attacks carried out by Ukrainian drones. At the same time, we saw that there was Kovyor, which is the Russian program to close down airports whenever there's incoming drones across a number of airports, including Kazan, Nizhikamask, and Izhevsk. Now, what's interesting about this plan Kovyor, which means carpet in Russian, is that today it's coming up a lot more often. Russians themselves are pretty shocked by this. They're pretty surprised. They never would have expected that this would come for them. And when Kovyor spreads across airports, the war forces the state to pause itself. Look at the rest of the attacks, though. Just last night, Krasnodar Krai, which is the Black Sea corridor, the disruption there, it slowed down air traffic. It slowed down logistics. It slowed down all the movement. The region was described as being under attack for a number of hours. In fact, a number of Luti drones were shot down over the region. The most interesting part, though, was that there was alarms that went off in places like Sochi and Gelendzhsk and it's Novorossiysk, Slavyansk, and Kuban. The airports in Krasnodar, Sochi, and Gelendzhsk were closed for more than 4 hours. But not in all places did they hear the alarms. In some parts of Russia, there were no alarms. There were just explosions. So how's that possible? Well, of course, there are times that the Ukrainians get through and the Russians don't detect it in time, and so the alarms don't go off. But there's another reason. The government in Moscow understands the situation is not good. The people see with their own eyes that it's getting worse. And so they have to do something now. They have to convince the population that all is not lost. Still keep your hope. Have faith. But why would you have faith when it's so very obvious that the government doesn't have a plan to stop these incoming attacks? The government, which planned to take the city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, in 3 days, is today struggling to keep all of its occupied territory under occupation, and it's being pushed daily off of those points. But more than that, there are still parts of Russia, like in the Kursk Oblast, under Ukrainian control, and the Russians still cannot eject the Ukrainians. Ukraine, day after day, is showing how it knows how to fight, and it wishes to fight for its freedom. But there's something fascinating that's also happening right now. We see that when Russia loses coordination, Ukraine takes ground. But to illustrate how bad it's really become for Russia, consider what U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said. According to him, United States intelligence believes that about 7,000 Russian soldiers are dying a week. That's pretty amazing when it comes to 28,000 soldiers per month. Now, in some other estimates, it's been said that it's closer to 32,000. But in all cases, we know that Russia's losses are colliding with the replacement ceiling. At current rates, Russia is bleeding faster than it can recruit people. It's lost 1.2 million soldiers killed or injured since February 2022. Russia's hundreds of thousands of soldiers it has lost, and it cannot replace. Russia is running a monthly deficit in trained men, and those deficits are now compounding. They can replace a lot of things, but they cannot replace the technology they've lost, and they cannot replace the land that they're losing, and they cannot replace the many soldiers they've lost. So the Russian people, we can tell, are worried by this, and that's why today they're becoming increasingly cautious. That reflects itself, of course, in things like consumer spending. When consumers are scared, they don't spend money. And that's why in Russia, we see things like housing prices down. We see in Russia that the largest construction company, Samolyot, now has protest in Russia from the workers because the workers have not been paid in 4 months. So things are clearly not going so well. So what do the Russian people do when they're scared, when they're nervous, when they're fearful, and they're not sure what's going to happen next? Well, apparently, they inform on their neighbors and their friends. In fact, according to leaked documents in Russia Telegram, over 150,000 Russians informed on their neighbors and friends and colleagues just in 2025. Making these denunciations is pretty incredible. Turning in the people you know shows a lot of problems in a society. But in Russia, that's standard. That's normal. Because in Russia, people have no idea how to take care of themselves if the government doesn't step in. This government is very clearly not interested in stepping in, and that's why the people of Russia are suffering. Look at the fact that today, 39% of household budgets now go to food. That's a 16-year high. And now, put this in the comparison, the average Western household spends between 10 to 15%. There's a reason, though, that Russians are paying more, and that's because logistics are getting more expensive. In fact, the cost of cucumbers increased 21% just in 1 month. For Russia, the situation is obviously not going quite as planned, but there's something else where it gets even more complicated, and that's that it has a leader that is not following what is happening. He doesn't understand the gravity of the situation that he is in. Or if we take the other argument that he does understand the gravity, then why is he not reacting? Once again, it comes to the same reason. He doesn't have a solution. None of them have a solution. Vladimir Putin today is in a country that's racked with economic problems. It's also got the problem that these sanctions are tightening. As they tighten, things will not get better. So, what will happen next? Well, there's a very good chance that for Russia, it'll be default. Now, it's a matter of time. Of course, we can't know exactly the day or the hour, but we can be sure of this. Right now, things are compounding. On one side, Russia is losing territory inside of Ukraine. Another side, it's losing territory inside of Russia. The population of Russia is turning against its government. But the most interesting part is how it could be perceived by the Kremlin. You look out on your country and you see that you're losing a war to Ukraine. Ukraine, before the war, only had a population of about 40 million people. Today, in free Ukraine, there's an estimated 26 million people. Now, contrast that to Russia's 140 million people. That's pretty bad that you're losing a war to them. Even worse when they are taking your territory. But there's no reason to be optimistic about anything else inside of Russia. The economic situation, it just gets worse. The situation, though, within the country, within the society, there's more tension than ever. People are not looking very optimistically as to what is going to happen next. And there's a lesson that Vladimir Putin should have learned from history, but not being a wise man, he never did. And that is that wars do not end when the leader decides that they end, when the leader gives up. They end when the logistics give out. Check out this video and you'll see why. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.